Hi, everyone. My name is Lenya Quinn-Davidson, and I am a fire advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension based in Humboldt County. And I work both here locally and statewide and even nationally on issues related to prescribed fire, especially with regard in recent years to policy work and to prescribed fire liability. So in my talk today, I have about 10 minutes, and I'm just going to give you a quick rundown about prescribed fire liability and some of the things you need to be thinking about when you're implementing pile burns or broadcast burns. I apologize for not being there in person, or I should say in real time, because I am hosting another workshop this week and couldn't be in attendance. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slideshow. And yeah, let's just spend this time thinking about liability. I know this is an issue that is of great concern to anyone who's putting fire on the ground, and it should be. It should be something that you're thinking about all the time, anytime that you're using fire. And before I get into some of the details of prescribed fire liability in California, I did want to remind folks that, you know, while we spend so much time thinking about and mitigating liability concerns, prescribed fire escapes are relatively rare, and damages from escapes are even more rare. So if we look at any of the studies related to liability around prescribed fire, like this one from John Weir, who's out of Oklahoma, we can see that the escape rate for prescribed fire, and that includes broadcast burning and pile burning, is generally right around 1%. So about 1 out of every 100 burns might escape control and require some additional resources to get it under control. But it is far, far, far fewer than that actually cause any damage or harm to anyone else's property. And so when we think about liability, when we're worried about it, we need to check ourselves that most of the time it's about our own perception of risk and not about the actual risk on the ground, because we can do so many things to mitigate those concerns and to keep things safe. Now, that said, pile burning is more risky in many ways than broadcast burning. And so people think pile burning is more simple, it's lower complexity, more people do it. But the truth is that a lot of escaped prescribed burns are escaped pile burns. And maybe they'll be covering this in other parts of the workshop, but piles tend to smolder for longer. They can be, kind of woken up weeks, even months later with a wind event or with particularly dry weather. There are a lot of concerns around piles, and I know Johnny Mac's going to cover, how to make clean piles that burn well and how to make sure you mop those up and just really cover yourself, because piles do have their own set of risks. So what do we mean when we talk about prescribed fire liability? There are a couple different things that we're talking about when we use that word. I think people just throw it around, what about the liability? What about the liability? But that it's a real set of problems that we're looking at, and there are multiple angles to it. So the one that I think most people think of is civil liability for third-party damages. So if you burn your neighbor's house down, or if you burn down a fence or burn up some timber, you cause damage to someone else's property. That is one big element of prescribed fire liability. But the one that's probably more commonly, brought into play is cost recovery for fire suppression. So if you're burning and something goes wrong and you're in that 1% where your fire escapes your control and you might need additional resources to come in and help you, CAL FIRE shows up with engines, maybe they bring a dozer, worst case scenario, they bring a helicopter, that you might be billed for those fire suppression resources. And that's a much more real concern than the damages to a third party's property. So as we've been working on all of this prescribed fire policy work in the last couple of years and really trying to mitigate those liability concerns, we have approached each of these two things in different ways. So let's look at liability law from a national perspective. There are generally 4 categories that different states fall into with regard to prescribed fire liability. On the really far end of being very restrictive toward prescribed fire are states that have strict liability laws. And in those cases, if something goes wrong, you are liable no matter what you were doing, even if you were doing everything as you should be. On the other end of the spectrum are states with gross negligence laws. So in that case, you have to be shown to have been grossly grossly negligent, so acting with reckless disregard in order to be held liable for for damages caused by a prescribed fire. And then there are states that have simple negligence laws, which mean you have to, it means you have to have been shown to have been negligent in order to be held liable. And then there are a few states out there that just have no language about prescribed fire liability. And so we call those undefined states, and they tend to default to a simple negligence standard if things go to court. Now, this map that I'm showing here is from a paper that was published in 2015, and I will note that it is out of date. A couple of states, including ours, have changed in the years since that paper was published. So in California, with regard to third-party damages from prescribed fire, we are a simple negligence state. So if you're burning and something happens and you cause damages to someone else's property, you will have to be shown to have been negligent in order to be held liable. And there's a lot to that. We could go into it if we had more time into what that actually means. But, following your permit, showing diligence, those are the kinds of things that show that you are not being negligent and that can give you protection. I always recommend having the required permits, following your permits. If you have a burn plan, burning within the prescription outlined in your burn plan, those are all the kinds of things that show that you're being diligent and not being negligent. Now, with regard to fire suppression costs, we made a big move last year and changed the state law to a gross negligence standard related to fire suppression costs from prescribed fire. So if you do require the additional resources to come in and help you, if CAL FIRE shows up because they think you need help, they can't send you a bill anymore unless they can prove that you were grossly negligent. And that's a pretty high bar. It's hard to prove gross negligence. So that was a big win in the state of California. This gives you as a burner a lot of additional protection from, basically it gives you the feeling that the state's got your back. If you're doing the right thing and you're doing a burn that's got public benefit or ecological benefit, and something goes wrong, that you have that support if you need it. And I think that's really important because what we don't want is people to have problems and be scared to call for help. If something goes wrong and you're doing the right thing, feel free to call in that support. But there are a couple caveats to that bill that we passed last year. So that was Senate Bill 332, if you want to look it up. And it, like I said, imparts a gross negligence standard for fire suppression costs related to prescribed fire. However, a key component of that is that it does require that there be a burn plan and that burn plan has been reviewed and approved by a state certified burn boss. So I want to talk a little bit more about the Burn Boss program because this is also a new piece that came out of legislation and that we've been building up for the last couple of years. It's all very new, but I do recommend that if you want that protection, that gross negligence standard, even if you're doing a big pile project, I probably don't recommend it for a small pile project or a very low complexity project, but if you're doing something that's more complex, having a burn plan and getting some advice and input from a state certified burn boss is a good idea. So what's the deal with this Burn Boss program? This was mandated by legislation back in 2018. And the idea behind it was really to have more people out there who can work with landowners, work with communities, work with tribes to plan and then lead the implementation of prescribed fire, and then to give those people some protection, some liability coverage so that they can really help us all increase the scale and scope of this work. So what's the benefit of this certification? So I think one of the big things is kind of a philosophical piece, but really about recognizing and validating practitioners that are outside the fire management agencies. So this program and the bill that caused it to come into creation, they're saying there are people who don't work in fire suppression, who don't work for agencies, who are skilled and competent in prescribed fire. And why wouldn't we want them also in this space doing more good work? Those state certified burn bosses do have the opportunity to share liability with CAL FIRE through a cooperative agreement process. And we haven't seen a lot of that. There are only about 10 state certified burn bosses in the state of California right now. So we're in this process of getting people trained and certified, taking people like Johnny Mack, who is a federally qualified burn boss, and getting him through that certification so that he can work with groups. So we're kind of in a growing phase right now with this program, but there is that opportunity to share liability with CAL FIRE. Again, as I mentioned before, these state certified burn bosses can review and approve burn plans to enable that gross negligence standard. So it's really important that we get more of these burn bosses out there, working with prescribed burn associations, working with landowners, helping people develop burn plans, and then, allowing them to take advantage of that changed liability standard. This burn boss program will also give access to a state-backed claims fund when it becomes operational. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but that's basically a state-backed insurance fund for prescribed fire to cover that damages piece, so that if damages occur, there's some way to cover that. And then the other exciting thing, I think, for landowners, like many of you, is that new NRCS policies recognize this state certification for burn planning and for implementation. So if you're a landowner and you want to take advantage of a program like EQIP, you might be able to hire one of these state certified burn bosses and have them be paid through those NRCS funds to do your burn plans for you and to help you actually implement the burn. So there's a lot of benefit here, and you can reach out to me if you're more, if you're interested in gaining the certification or in finding someone in your area who might have the certification and be willing to come and work with you. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is the state prescribed fire claims fund. Now, $20 million was set aside in the state wildfire budget in 2021 to develop what we're calling a pilot claims fund. So it's kind of a pilot program to fill the insurance gap around prescribed fire. There are very few prescribed fire insurance options. So if you're trying to do projects, if you're a state certified burn boss, if you want to work in this space or implement these kinds of projects, you really can't get insurance. The insurance policies that are out there are prohibitively expensive. I mean, thousands and thousands of dollars per burn or per day. So the state recognized this as an issue. And the Nature Conservancy and I and others worked on advancing a bill this last year in 2022. That was Senate Bill 926, that forced the operationalization of the fund. So the money was sitting there, but nothing was happening with it. So SB 926 said, okay, we got to get, we have to roll this out. We have to make it available to practitioners. So there's a working group right now that's designing the process, figuring out all the intricacies. It's really complicated to think about a state-backed insurance fund, or it's kind of like a catastrophe fund. But we're hoping to start providing coverage this spring. And the main gist of it is that the coverage will be for individual projects. So not for individual people who are implementing, but for the actual project itself, which would be identified through a burn plan. And that there will be a $2 million maximum coverage per project. So if something were to go wrong and, there were damages that added up to less than 2 million, the claims fund could cover all of that. And if it were more than that, that would trigger some other processes and conversations, obviously. But those projects, in order to be covered, must be led by a state certified burn boss, a federally qualified burn boss, or a cultural practitioner. So that is one piece to be aware of. And it'll be on kind of a reservation system. So, you'll have a project, you'll line up your burn boss, you'll have your burn plan, and then you'll basically check out coverage from the state. So all of that's forthcoming, and feel free to email me if you want more information or want to be added to my policy mailing list. So with that, I'll end. And this is just a little teaser of all the liability stuff and policy work that we've been doing, but feel free to reach out. I'm a resource statewide, and hope the rest of the workshop goes really well. Thanks so much.